Section 17 of Psychology, the Cognitive Powers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Leinhart. Psychology, the Cognitive Powers by James McCosh. Book Second, The Reproductive or Representative Power. The Association of Ideas, Part 5. Section 3. Physiological processes involved in association. The question is put whether I have explained thoroughly the facts of association. I answer that it is doubtful whether this has been done by anyone. There is one important element of which no account has been taken. Association of ideas must depend partly on the brain, on the gray cellular matter at the periphery, or on the currents through the brain, or, as I rather think, on both, the nature and disposition of the cells determining the direction of the currents. There is reason to believe that every action of the mind, intellectual and emotive, leaves an impress on the brain. It may be maintained that a concurrence of brain action is necessary to mental action, particularly to the calling up of the ideas of material objects. Our ideas flow more pleasantly when the brain is in a healthy state. On the other hand, we feel embarrassed in the ordering of our thoughts when oppressed with a headache. We labor to call up a series of ideas, and we find that they will not appear. Late at night, after hours of anxious thought, we find that the required train will not move on. It will start on its journey only after we have been refreshed by sleep. It is clear that the cellular powers or nervous currents must help or hinder the use and flow of ideas. I believe that every thought and every feeling produces an effect upon the cellular portion of the brain and leaves an impress upon it. Now, in order to the reproduction of the thought and feeling in memory, it seems to be necessary to have a cooperation of the organ of the brain thus affected and to have the aid of currents. When the association has not this concurrence, it is hindered and restrained. How irksome do we find it to learn the grammar of a new language, or the technicalities of a new science, or indeed to penetrate into any unfamiliar subject, while we find it easy to use the tongue, or follow the science, or to speak on the topic, when lines have, as it were, been made for us in the brain to carry us on. So when there is a lesion in a particular part of the brain, we may lose certain of our recollections, say of Greek, or of certain events in our past life. In old age, memory is the first faculty that fails because of decaying or decayed organs. The recollection of names is apt to go first because, names being commonly arbitrary, there are no mental correlations to bring them up, and we have to hunt for connected ideas to call them forth. I have observed when names have correlations, when they are titles or are expressive of the objects, they are as easily brought up as other things. Physiology has to advance several stages before it can give a full account of the connection of the brain with the use of thought. We should be grateful to it for any light it may throw on the subject. But two important positions are to be defended. First, the ideas in the mind are not mere cellular or nervous products. We cannot perceive them by the senses. The microscope has not detected them. We are conscious of them, and our consciousness tells us their nature, which is mental and not physical. Secondly, there are mental laws of association, such as I have just been seeking to enunciate and illustrate, say contiguity and correlation. These are undoubtedly the principal laws guiding the flow of our ideas, the physiological ones being merely subsidiary. This may be the most appropriate place for noticing the circumstance that as trains of thought, at first conscious and voluntary, are confirmed by frequent repetition, they become more involuntary, and we are scarcely conscious of them. Thus, we come to run over the letters of the alphabet and the numbers 1, 2, 3 to 100 without an effort, with scarcely any feeling, and with no recollection. It is supposed that many of our organic actions were originally voluntary, but are now involuntary and unconscious. I am convinced, however, that much of this action has still a sort of dull consciousness attached to it, and that the dormant will may awake on occasions. This may account for some of the curious phenomena of our compound nature, such as mesmerism, dreaming, and so forth. Measurements, not always trustworthy, have been made as to the time occupied in reflex action, as when a sound or sight goes up to the brain and is answered by speech, but it has been found more difficult to determine the time occupied by our purely mental acts, say by a succession of ideas in counting. Is there any relation between the normal time of the successive ideas in our mind and that of the beating of the pulse and winking of the eyes? It is certain that the flow of ideas differs very widely in different states. In fever, the rapidity may become very great. Section 4. The rapidity of thought. Lord Brougham has given us instances of the rapidity of thought. He was dictating when he fell asleep while his clerk wrote the sentence he had dictated. On awaking, he found that an immense number of thoughts had passed through his mind. But we have now more accurate measurements. I have been favored with the following summary by James Mark Baldwin, A.B., ex-fellow of Princeton College. See his excellent translation of Ribot's German Psychology of Today. The measurement of the duration of mental acts was begun by Donders about 1861. Before him, it was generally admitted that psychic processes must be construed in time, and the question of the rapidity of thought was discussed from a standpoint of consciousness. We think sometimes faster, sometimes more slowly, but this subjective estimation of time was necessarily vague, inasmuch as it was impossible to eliminate the physical and emotional influences which alter the flow of our ideas. Since the discoveries of Helmholtz and others as to the velocity of nerve transmission, it has become possible to arrive at a determinate expression for the time necessary to some of the simpler processes. 1. In parentheses. Beginning with sense perception, the simplest intellectual act, the case is briefly this. Let the skin of a man in normal condition be pricked, and let the subject speak as soon as the pain is felt. The period which elapses is called the simple reaction time, and is found to vary with the different senses from 1/8 to 1/5 of a second. Upon consideration, it is readily seen that this period may be divided into 3 parts. First, sensor transmission to the brain. Second, the mental process of perception and volition. And third, motor transmission to the organs of speech. Now, since the velocity in both the motor and sensor nerves is known, we reach by subtraction the time of the mental act. Instruments are used by means of which differences to the 10,000th of a second are noted. Avoiding figures, which are still somewhat in dispute, we may give 2 general principles. A, in parentheses, the simplest mental act occupies an appreciable period of time. B, in parentheses, the purely physiological time is less than half of the entire reaction. 2, in parentheses, passing from simple perception to the reproduction of ideas as memory pictures, it is concluded from experiments conducted upon similar methods that A, in parentheses, the time of the reproduction of a state of consciousness is longer than the time of its production. B, the time of reproduction depends upon the degree of energy exerted, 1, in the original perception, and 2, in the reproduction. 3, in parentheses, a third operation upon which many experiments have been made and definite results obtained is that of discernment or discrimination. 2 colored lights are shown indiscriminately, and the subject is to react only when he sees the color agreed upon beforehand. This involves first a comparison and second a judgment. By an easy process, the purely physiological time is eliminated, and the duration of the mental act is found to be 1/20th of a second, crease, to 1/10th of a second, Wundt. 4, in parentheses, Experiment has rendered service also in defining and confirming the laws of association. The time of a simple association is determined, that is, 3/4 to 4/5 of a second. 5 in parentheses. A fifth class of experiments relates to the logical judgment of subordination from species to genus. It is found that the time is longest when the subject is abstract and the predicate a more general notion, shortest when the subject is concrete and the predicate a less general notion. The average of a great number of experiments gives the time about 1 second. It should be said that these results are true only in an average sense and under normal conditions. During the last 5 years, great activity has been shown in the study of abnormal and artificial states, but the difficulties are very great, and the present condition of the science does not warrant a positive statement of results. It may be added, however, that in every case the general utterances of the inner sense are directly confirmed, and the ultimateness of consciousness as the psychological point of departure is in so far vindicated. Section 5. Discussions as to the laws of association. I have illustrated the subject in the loose way in which it is commonly presented, but difficult and disputed points have arisen. All are agreed that contiguity is a law of association. Some reckon it the sole law, and argue that by some little subtlety all other laws, such as that of resemblance, can be reduced to it. It will also be generally allowed that there is a law of correlation to the effect that, having discovered a relation between objects, when the one comes up, the other is apt to follow. But it is evident that this may be merely an exemplification of the law of contiguity, for the objects have been together in the mind. It is clear, however, that the correlation discovered greatly strengthens the association. We remember a discourse much more readily when the thoughts were connected. It is for that reason we can commit to a memory a piece of poetry more easily than one of the same length in prose. In the former case, we have not only the contiguities but the congruities to carry us on. We have the correlations of sound and sense. There is an amusing story told of a minister who, on finding a boy at the helm guiding a vessel, inquired of him if he could box the compass, which he did. He then asked him to do the same backward, which he also did. The boy then asked the minister to say the Lord's Prayer, to which the clergyman complacently assented. The boy then insisted on his saying the Lord's Prayer backward, which he declined to undertake. The boy was able to interpret the instrument backward because in the compass he had correlations, whereas the other had none in the Lord's Prayer. Scientific truths are more easily called up than scattered, disconnected ones, because they have been placed under laws of correlation or connection. But the question arises, do correlated things suggest each other before the correlation has been discovered? On entering a room, we see a portrait on the wall, and we immediately think of the original, whom we have often met. Had we ever seen the original and the painting together, the idea would have been called up by the law of contiguity. But we never heard that there was a portrait of the person, and yet his figure casts up. Apparently it does so by the law that like recalls like. Prima facie, the law of resemblance seems a simple and original one, and has commonly been so regarded. It should be noticed that in order to correlative association, the two objects must both have been previously in the mind. The portrait is before us, and we are acquainted with the figure and expression of the original. In seeking to penetrate deeper into the nature of the suggestion of resemblance, it is to be borne in mind that objects are known by their qualities, and that all actual objects are complex or concrete, that is, have several qualities, and they are so remembered by us. Let the letters of the alphabet denote the objects related. Let us denote the portrait with its qualities as A, B, C, D, in which A, B are the figure and expression, and C, D the canvas, frame, etc. This portrait recalls the person A accent, B accent, X, Y, etc., when A accent, B accent are the features and expression, and X, Y, etc., the man's walk and gestures. Now it may be argued that A, B of the portrait call up A accent, B accent of the person, while the others, X, Y, come up according to the law of contiguity. If this view be correct, it is the same that calls up the same, the second same calling up by contiguity the objects associated with it. It may be more difficult to explain in this way other correlated associations, but let us try some of them. In doing so, we may find that every relation has a ground, and that they are the same qualities in each object forming the correlation that constitute the principle of the association. It should be observed, however, that it is not by the affinity of abstract qualities that the association takes place, but simply by the objects possessing the same qualities, by the portrait and the original both possessing the same qualities, figure and expression, in this respect being alike. We can account in the same way for contrast being, as Aristotle asserted, a law of association. Contrast, as a relation, comes under general correlation of resemblance and difference. In all contrast there is implied some sameness. There is no contrast of things entirely different, and the implied sameness, AB, in both binds the objects together in our minds. This seems to be the law of correlative association. The same suggests the same, which by contiguity brings in correlative objects, and the relations are perceived by the mind. Those acquainted with the lectures of Thomas Brown of Edinburgh will remember that he has two kinds of suggestion, simple and relative. Simple being much the same as I have been describing in Chapter 3, Section 1. But relative suggestion embraces two powers, the one association proper, and the other the discovery of relations. These, I think, should be carefully separated. The latter is really the power of discovering relations or comparison, but while they are different, they may combine in the way I have been endeavoring to describe, and the process may be called relative suggestion. Let us view the mind acting under this power. When objects present themselves to us by sense or by image, they do so by means of their qualities. Our anxiety is to know what the object is and how it stands related to other objects. Whence has it come? How does it act? As we keep the object or idea before us, one associated quality after another presents itself, all, it may be, in an immeasurably short time. We say, quick as thought. As they do so, the mind perceives by its power of comparison various relations, and as the result we find what the object is, what its nature and its use. That cry is the same as I heard in my boyhood. In the mountain region I used to visit, it is the screech of an eagle. That sound is of a bell inviting me to the house of prayer. That picture has the features and expression of a friend I knew well, and is his portrait. The wound of that person lying on the ground is the same as I have seen inflicted by a gunshot, and I fear the person has been murdered. A boy is going along a road with a satchel of books. This suggests a school, and we decide that the boy is going to school. We may have noticed that it is only after allowing the object, as we think of it, to suggest one quality after another, that we touch the chord which discloses to us what we are in search of, the nature and use of the object. Thus closely are the associations of correlation and the discovery of relations connected together and mutually aiding each other. But the farther discussion and illustration of this subject and its application to cause and effect, to identity and other relations, may be expediently deferred till we come to discover the nature of comparison and relation under Book 3, the Comparative Powers. It should be noticed that a great many of our associations are carried on by means of words. These words are primarily associated with thoughts and things by the law of contiguity, but each of them is associated with other things which are brought into relation with each other in our minds. The orator is enabled to carry on his speech without a break, the thoughts and words mutually suggesting each other. We may often notice a very beautiful play of association in the conversation carried on by a company of intelligent and witty people. each starting and pursuing suggestions with their numberless correlations. I am here giving as important a place to association as those who, following David Hume, have accounted by it for our conviction as to cause and effect and the deeper principles of the mind. A large body of profound philosophers maintain that there are necessary principles in the mind, such as that requiring us to believe that an effect must have a cause. The school to which I have referred, and which I may call the school of Hume or the empirical school, explains this by invariable association, the cause and effect having ever been together. We cannot think of the one without also thinking of the other. Now, it is undoubtedly true that when things have been invariably together in the mind in the past, the one will recall the other. But this is a very different kind of necessity of conviction from that which is attached to fundamental truth. It can be shown that this last proceeds from self-evidence, is seen to be in the nature of the thing perceived, and is perceived by the reason. We perceive that it is in the very nature of the cause to produce its effect, for example, a fire to burn. The law of contiguity may produce invariable associations and make one thing to come up after another in the mind, but cannot produce necessary convictions or judgments pronounced on a discovery of relations in the nature of the things. It is now acknowledged that mere contiguity cannot give us a priori truth, and we have a new theory that this is gendered by heredity, of which all I have to remark here is that it may give us tendencies of thinking, but certainly not the decisions of reason. But while association and heredity cannot do this, it may aid our comparative or judging powers by bringing before the mind the ideas on which they pronounce a judgment. I have shown elsewhere, Logic, pages 166-167, that association brings together, more especially by the laws of correlation, the notions major, minor, and middle which are compared. End of section 17.